Yes guys, what is going on? Hope you're having a fantastic day. Today we are back with another Hurt to Healing Tales of Triumph episode. Today we are going to be talking about your five senses: touch, taste, hearing, smell and eyesight. What we're going to be doing is talking about what our five senses are, how they actually interact with our central nervous system, and essentially how to best control them in your own ability. So what are our five senses and how do they help? So our five senses are helping us analyze different stimuli around our general environment on an internal and an external scale. So in our everyday lives, we experience sometimes a sensory overload of information, and this information comes in through one of our five senses. Either we see it, we hear it, we smell it, we taste it, or we can touch it. Now there are five different senses. Now those different five senses will then send an electrical pulse to our central nervous system, which will then send a signal to our brain to be able to identify what is happening, I'm very tired today, I can't talk. What our brain then does is analyze this information and then has a appropriate response to what is going on, whether it sometimes doesn't need to respond to anything, or whether it needs to turn its head, or sometimes there's a variation of different things in emergency procedures: fight or flight, freeze or flop. There's shut down, freeze. There's different things that it might need to happen in an emergency situation, or you can trigger an emotional response, or it can trigger any other kind of response that it needs to respond to that particular thing that's going on. So just as much as our brain uses this information for an emergency situation, it also allows us to relax, rest and digest, and have safe, enjoyable fun, and be able to know when you can be calm and when you need to be in an emergency situation. So our five senses, when we are a child, is very different to how our brain reacts using our five senses when we're an adult. So our five senses can be essentially damaged in terms of how our brain reacts to different stimuli of what's going to happen. So a traumatic experience on a child's trauma affects a child's sensory system by simply damaging its ability to do age-related tasks. As further they get, my words are just not coming out. The more that we age, after having dealt with some traumatic experiences from a child, we then have that PTSD symptoms of what actually happened when we were a child in the first place. So, for example, let's use me for an example. Good example, right? I had lots of abuse done to me, and the main trigger for me is something to do with smells. Smells are very, very big for me. So, each smell, for example, triggers me to go back to that particular state of my life. Smells of like lasagna, leek potato soup and stuff, I can smell it a mile off without even thinking about it. Those particular smells, received through one of my five senses, then sends an emergency trigger to my brain, which then almost shuts off my receptory systems and what I'm able to do on that particular time of whenever it's happening. So if I am down the pub. I've used this for an example before, but it's because it's a pretty good example. So I'm down the pub, for example, I am having a pint with someone and they want to get food, they order a lasagna or they order a soup, and then I get triggered because of that smell, right? Received through that sense, it then sends a signal to my brain, and my brain goes, we smelt this during that time, therefore we need to initiate our emergency procedures to ensure that we're safe, and whatever happened then doesn't happen now. Then you use your grounding techniques and you use one of your tools and techniques to be able to bring yourself down from that fight or flight engagement down into more of a homeostasis mode, so that you're actually able to deal with that trigger at that time, so that it doesn't affect you at that time. Now, a child's ability to do that is going to be a lot less than me, for example. I've only learned this skill and been able to teach this skill for the past year, or not even that long, right? Because it's actually being able to identify this and then be able to actually do it is very, very hard. It takes a long time. I've been dealing with my triggers for years now, and I've been trying to deal with them in different ways, but it's very hard to find out what actually works, how it works, when it works, why it works. So children actually struggle to participate in very daily tasks because of this reoccurring trigger, because they don't know how to then bring themselves back down from the fight or flight mode down into homeostasis mode to be able to relax and then actually enjoy and feel safe in that time, because they've been triggered, and then immediately they want them to go through what they've already been through. So they've been activated. It's very then, especially from a child's perspective, because they don't know how to do that. So once one of their five senses has been potentially damaged in that way, in terms of that is how they respond to that thing, and until they get older or they gain the understanding of why and how to calm themselves down, they will always respond in that way. And that's not their fault. It's whoever did it to them is their fault, because it's not the child's fault for having had done to them. Yes, that makes sense. So how does this, from a child's perspective, so say, right, you have been through extensive trauma, you understand your trauma, you understand then that, okay, you've been through those things, you understand, you're starting to put the tools and techniques in place, and now you're sort of furthering your education and going through those things. How does that dysregulation impact your adult life from childhood? So essentially it is sensory processing. So essentially it's sensory processing problems. Now, sensory processing problems are when you receive information through one of your five senses, you then have a problem interpreting that information, and you then don't know how to respond to that information that's come through. For example, this is why I always say information is king, knowledge is king, because the more you know about yourself, the more you know about your senses, the more you know about your traumas and your triggers, then you can start to identify when you've been triggered, how you've been triggered, why you've been triggered, and you're very easy to bring yourself back down into a homeostasis mode rather than fight or flight all the time. So that's something extremely key to actually look at and make sure that you are fully aware of. Now, trauma impacts the brain and the body so very much. There's Babette Rothschild has talked a lot about the body remembers and the body keeps the score, and there's Louise Hay as well, who's written many books on how trauma is manifested inside the body. Now, trauma manifests inside the body, but it has to get into the body at some point. Again, received through one of our five senses. Now, the information that gets put into our brain gets stored into our brain, and then you have to allow that information to be released. Sometimes it will never be released, but a lot of the information will need to be released and will need to be processed. This unprocessed trauma that's happened to us, that's been received from one of our five senses, is then stored and then causes dysregulation inside the body and inside the brain, and it then disrupts the brain chemicals. It can then cause us to have lack of sleep, it can cause us to have lots of different eating disorders, or it can have lots of different mental health disorders, when actually these mental health disorders are a symptom of the trauma that's actually happened. So you have to be very careful about what's happening, why it's happening, and then be able to identify how best to deal with that thing because of what's going on. So we've covered the five main senses: touch, taste, hearing, smell, and eyesight. Very self-explanatory, but there you actually have two extra senses that not many people know about. So these extra two senses are proprioceptive sense. It's a big word to get out. Proprioceptive sense, and this is essentially knowing where your body is in relative space. So the best way to describe this is like people who soldiers and stuff who have had in the wartime, and they've been involved in a bomb or something, and they've lost a limb, and they have like phantom leg or a phantom arm where they still think that they know where their hand is when they don't actually have one. The best way to describe that is where you are in relative space. Some people have really bad spatial awareness, and so they have a less defined proprioceptive sense than other people. And the other one is vestibular sense. Now, the vestibular sense is speed, whether we're stationary, whether we're walking, whether we're fast walking, whether we're running, whether we're sprinting, that kind of ability to know how fast we're going in relative space. So the vestibular sense is also responsible for direction of movement. And so whether you're sat upright, whether you're hunched over, it has a massive part to play on your posture, massive part to play in your alertness, in your balance, your coordination, those different kinds of things. Because if you are obviously sprinting and then have to go into like one-legged hold, then that's going to be very hard. You're going to understand that some people are going to be able to do that, some people aren't going to be able to do that. Depending on how good this sense is going to be dependent on how good you are at holding yourself in certain positions and doing those different kinds of things. So all of the information that ever happens around us is received through one of these different senses, whether somebody rushes by us, or whether somebody smells really bad, or whether somebody looks at us, or we hear something, we smell something, we eat something. And that's why food is very tactile, and some people don't like food, not because of the flavor, but because of the textures and different things, how it's received into our mouth and how we then have to eat it and digest it and different things. So all of this information sends neurological part. All of this information is received through one of our five senses and then travels along a neurological pathway to the central nervous system, therefore to the brain, to then be received and then analyzes information, and then an appropriate response is deemed by the brain. And this happens nanoseconds. It's amazing how quickly the brain is actually able to receive this information, process it, and then deal with an appropriate response. Depending on how well kept your brain is, so the brain is a muscle like any other, and it needs to be kept in good shape, good order. It needs to be fed with good nutrients, needs to be exercised properly, needs to make sure that there's no unnecessary swelling in terms of headaches and migraines and stuff, make sure it's watered properly, and make sure that it can then function properly. And the better functioning your brain is, the faster and the better you're going to be able to receive and deal with this information, and then subsequently better your brain's going to be at receiving and dealing with this information, rather than it all getting just like, obviously, if there has been significant trauma to an individual, then their sensory motor functions are going to be impaired. So if there's been significant trauma, then especially from a young age, from like childhood, then that's going to be struggles actually processing all this information at once, because their brain has been so overloaded from such a young age. Usually time and time again, hopefully not, but usually time and time again, the more it happens, the harder it is to then actually understand it and dysregulation, so that they can better repair these neural pathways in the first place. Once these neural pathways have been broken and damaged in so many different ways over a long period of time, it's very hard to repair them. It's not impossible, I've done it, but it's very, very hard for you to actually sit there and repair the brain and repair the neural pathways and repair the information neural link between the five senses, or one of the senses, and then the brain, and then how that brain then deals with that information and then sends out the signals. So depending on how much inner work you do, depending on how much external work you do, depending on how you feed yourself, depending on how you exercise, depending on how you deal with your triggers and your mind and all those different kinds of things, there's so much that goes into it to actually repairing neural pathways, and if you're even able to repair neural pathways and those different kinds of things, to actually then how much of a really thrivable life that you are actually able to live. Because everybody wants to live a thrivable life, everybody can live a thrivable life, but it's very hard, and it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of preparing, it takes a lot of everything to be able to do that. And so the younger the child is and the more trauma the child has received, the harder it's going to be for that child to then repair those neural pathways and deal with the information it receives from their five senses. So that's and then again, the child has to want to do it, and they might even be able to do it until they're my age. You never know. Like, I never wanted to do, I never wasn't even know about this, even able to do it till I was at least 21. So you have to look at those different kinds of things and just be super, super careful, obviously making sure that everybody's on the same wavelength. So how has this helped me? So I'm gonna have a sip of tea. Like I just said, I didn't know about this until only a few years ago. And the journey that I've been on has been insane. And there's no other way to put it. And actually how I deal with myself and my triggers and all of those different kinds of things. And it is absolutely nuts. Repairing my neural pathways has been something it's a whole different topic of conversation. Repairing the way that I look at triggers and the way that I deal with my triggers with the information received through my five senses is more topic of conversation for today. Like I say, knowledge is king, knowledge is power. The more knowledge you have about yourself and your triggers and your everything, then the more you're going to be able to deal with everything that's going on. So I would, without a shadow of a doubt, like we spoke about last week in terms of mind mapping, write down every single trigger. So create a list of every single trigger that you have at each sense. So right at top of the page, smell, and then write everything down, everything that triggers you. And again, this will directly correlate to the work we did last week, because last week I said about plotting mind maps and timelines, and then subsequently planning out those moments that you remember the worst or the best or whatever, and then in those moments you'll have your triggers. Find out what those triggers are, and then again explain them in great detail and actually understand what it is specifically about those triggers that trigger you and why they trigger you. Once you have that information, how is that trigger received through one of your five senses? All right, so this is the furthering on from the work we did last week. So how is one of those triggers, so like me for lasagna, take that for a prime example, I can see it, I can smell it, and I can hear people talk about it. Right, so there's those three different times of triggers that I can have for that one particular thing. right? Leaky potato soup, same principle. I can see it, I can smell it, and I can hear people talk about it, right? So there's those different kinds of things. So then you have to think about what correlation that then triggers you. So like, I hear somebody talk about it, I don't even really think about it, to be fair. If I smell it and I can see it from the other side of the room, and I probably wouldn't think too much about it. It's, for me, it's when I smell it the most. That's when I'm like, wow, it takes me back to where it was. So identify which trigger is the most triggering for you and work on that one first. So how do you work on this trigger? So it's all good and well writing everything down and having these timelines and having everything that's written down. It's, it's all well and good having that, but until you have physical, tangible things that you can actually do in any situation is really what's going to work. So I know we spoke a lot about central nervous system regulation and a lot of those things that do work. Now, I'll be honest, a lot of those things have worked for me. Deep breathing is one of the biggest things, and simple things like saying what happened to you in a private room by yourself, just again and again and again, so that the words don't have any power over you. Might be silly, but like, I watched an episode of Doctor Who, right, when I was a kid, and it was all about witches, and the witches were with like Shakespeare. It was a David Tennant episode, brilliant episode. The witches needed Shakespeare and the Globe Theatre because the words had power. So the words gave the witches power to be able to summon other witches, and then Shakespeare was able to stop them with more words, right? Words do have power. They say sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words are so powerful. So powerful. The right words at the right time, spoken in the right way by the right person, can make or break someone. Giving someone encouragement, not giving someone encouragement. So I found simply just saying it to myself over and over again, journaling as well, something been massive for me, just again writing it out so that it doesn't have any power over me, so that when these things do happen, I just think, and then I can say it to myself in my head, and I'm just like, okay, cool, and move on. It hasn't always worked for me. I needed some physical things, so something like a stress ball, something you can squeeze and you can be there and you can take your anger out on it, so that you don't then take your anger out on other people, for example. Going to the gym regularly has been a massive thing for me. That's something that's really worked for my clients as well, so something that's really good. And then other things like cold water has been really good, in terms of just like if you splash some cold water on your face, you can sort of bring yourself back to the present moment, just some distant thoughts, and then grounding work. Grounding work is something we're going to cover in a lot more detail in a few weeks' time, because grounding is really important, how to ground yourself in your emotions and stuff. But essentially what I've done in public with other people is just like list things that you can see that are of a nice colour. So like list 5 things in the room that are pink, or list 5 things in the room that are green, depending on where you are. Things that might not be pink, but if you really look, what that does is it essentially brings you back to the present moment. So you get triggered, receive information, you get sent back to that place years ago, and then you start looking around the room and start counting out things that are blue, right? There's a blue lampshade, that lady's wearing a blue top, he's wearing blue shoes, right? And then rather than where you were, you're now bringing yourself back to where you are. And then you allow yourself to tell yourself that you are in control of what you're doing. Another thing that's really good is aligning your chakras in terms of how you speak to yourself. So positive affirmations, something you can do again at the time. It's rather than always I am. So there's obviously all the different chakras, which again we will cover in a different video. I am okay. I am safe. Working from I always get the chakras wrong. That's the bottom one, I am, and then we move all the way up to the brain, the mind chakra, in terms of I understand that these things happen to me. I understand that these things are a part of me. I understand that I am now safe, and I am now strong, and I understand that I am able to deal with these things, and I am able to I understand I am able to control my thoughts and my feelings, those different kinds of things. So you work from the bottom in terms of how you say your things, and then you have specific mantras that you can basically say for yourself in that your specific situation. So they're the things that have worked the best for me in terms of dealing with the different sensory things that are going on. Again, some specific 5 senses related things that can happen to you. Like I say, you can have a stress ball, which is touch. You can have like smelling salts or lavender or essential oils. That's what I was looking for, the word. Essential oils you can smell. You can have headphones that you can, noise cancelling headphones, so you can block out sound, or you can play music, so you can worry about that. Blindfold or sunglasses or something along those lines, so that you can lull the seeing, or you can have blue light glasses, whatever it may be. And you could have some like crisps or something like that, something to drink, to again worry about the taste. So depending on what situation's going on for you, you'll be able to do that. So for me, how that's worked for me, the headphones have been always a really cool thing for me. I either just putting noise cancelling headphones on without any music, so I can be there in my own silence, or listening to some kind of music to distract me about what's going on for that particular moment. Eating something, again, being careful with that one. Smells are really, like I say, smells are a massive one for me, probably the biggest one for me. So just being able to, with those different smells, like I would go outside so I could smell something new, and then back in and deal with that maybe in that particular way. How I used to deal with it was going out and smoking, so then I would just smell smoke all the time. However, I know that that's not healthy, and I do not recommend that, but that's what I used to do. So that's been really helpful. Again, drinking of some description, doesn't have to be alcohol, just something like very fruity or not fruity, whatever it may be for you. Finding something that works in those types of realms is really good. And again, writing down what works and writing down what doesn't work, so you have this information build up of what is good and what is bad and what doesn't work. So that's this week's task, finding different sensory things that you can do that do work and don't work when you get triggered. And again, finding out why these triggers are happening, how they're most triggered in terms of lasagna, in terms of smell or sight, or hearing about it. So again, write down your information, understand what's going on, why it's going on, how it's going on, and then try different sensory techniques to try and block it, or to try and stay engaged in the moment, ground yourself to that moment. But that's the 5 senses, guys. I hope you learned something. I hope you took something away from this video. This is a pretty cool one. This is something that's been massive for me in my time. So please comment your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like and share this with somebody that you think might be helpful to follow along the journey for. Don't forget to subscribe, and I shall see you in the next one.